Hey gang, Coach Greg here with Devil Dog Martial Arts, and today we're going to begin starting to talk about principles of striking. This is one of those buzzwords a lot of schools throw around, like martial arts is all about principles and concepts. But in application, a lot of people don't actually describe what those principles are. So today we're going to start talking about the first 10 of those 40 principles that I've outlined. For the full list, you can go to my website. I'll post the link below, devilDogMartialArts.com, and there you can find the full list of 40, but we're going to start breaking down these first 10. So stay tuned, let's start getting the first one. The first of our principles is the Heirarchy Principle, which essentially states that in every fight or sparring session or contest between two people, you're going to have one or two battles that are the really most critical battles to win. And these can vary for a bunch of different things depending on who you're fighting, what type of sport it is, whether it's boxing or Muay Thai, MMA. But you really have to know what those battles are going into it in order to be successful. In some cases, it could be as simple as, Alexander Volkanovski just fought Islam Makhachev. One of the key battles on that one is to keep the fight standing. Sometimes in the Nemean fight system, we talk about fighting from an open stance with a southpaw. It's about maintaining outside foot position or top hand position. But whatever it is, whether it's winning the hand fighting battle, head fighting, space and range, you have to really understand what those one or two things are that's going to define this match. The second of our principles is the funneling principle. Now, the funneling principle is essentially finding ways to limit your opponent to one or two more predictable movements. Now, one of the issues sometimes in fighting is there's so much that he can throw at me that it's hard to know how to counter all these potential incoming things. So funneling allows you to limit that. There's a couple ways you can do that. One example of that is if I strike and then I move backwards, I have now maintained a specific range that in order to access me, he needs to use longer attacks. So the likelihood of him using close hooks and uppercuts and stuff like that is going to significantly decrease. Instead, what we're looking at most likely is either a long type of a kicking technique or more likely some sort of a long jab cross or something along those lines. He now has to cover more distance, which means I can limit him down to a couple predictable responses. Another example of that is, for example, if I do something like an angle change that I post to the outside on that 3/4 back corner where I'm pushing his shoulder away, he now is limited in the ways that he can access me, right? He can't really freely access me with this hand. He can't come across this way. So he might kick me with a side kick with that front leg or something like that. But either way, I can limit him down to a couple of predictable responses. And that's what the funneling principle is about, is taking somebody and reducing their choices to something that's easier to counter. Our third principle is the high percentile principle. And this is something that I think a lot of martial arts could stand to learn a little bit. The high percentile principle is basically the 80-20 rule. 80% of your time should be spent on 20% of your techniques, right? But it's also more than that. It's understanding what are the most high percentile attacks that you're likely to encounter, and what are the attacks that you're going to use that are going to be high percentile in terms of yielding the most results, that you're going to use the most and be the most successful with. There are a lot of niche techniques out there in martial arts that, yes, theoretically they could work. There are a lot of niche responses that your opponent might give you that, yes, they could work. But the likelihood of you encountering that is much lower. A good example is in Taekwondo, they have a ton of great responses for somebody who throws a roundhouse kick. However, in a self-defense situation, the likelihood of running into somebody throwing a roundhouse kick at me is significantly lower than somebody throwing some incarnation of a left-right. So we spend a lot more of our time dealing with defending against a good left-right rather than spending a lot of time dealing with that roundhouse. Not to say that you shouldn't learn to defend a roundhouse kick, but more time should be spent on dealing with that particular situation. Our fourth principle is the threat and variable principle. Now, the threat and variable principle essentially states that I'm going to create a threat that my opponent must respond to. When he does, he is going to open himself up for the variable. Good example of that I like to use is if you look at somebody like Wonder Boy Stephen Thompson, he's going to throw his right hand, and he's going to start throwing hands. And what he's going to do is force you to defend high. When he does, he's able to open you up for the side kick. Now you can stack these. As he starts getting comfortable defending that side kick with that jab, now I can start switching and adding a third variable in. He gets used to defending these two things, so now I add in a leg kick. What I've essentially done is created a situation where this opponent must now deal with the incoming threat. When he does so, he leaves himself exposed for something else that's going to come at him. Our fifth principle is the top position principle. Now, there's a lot of different incarnations of this, but This is essentially stating that there is a dominance in maintaining top position in striking. There are a lot of different places where you'll find this is very valuable. For example, in the Nemean fight system, we talk about fighting from the long guard a lot here, right? One of my goals of my top hand is maintaining top position. We're going to win this hand fighting battle all the time. Why? Because I can now access him with my jabs, but he cannot easily access me. It is about taking away their access to me. Another example of that is if you have somebody who's a kicker, a lot of times the best way to stop that is to put your leg and just be on top of their foot. When they go to kick, just be on top of their leg, be above the thigh, forcing them to encounter this buff, this interference in the technique. And that's essentially what they're going to do. I now have access to you, you don't have access to me. Same thing like cut kicks is a really good example of that in the Taekwondo cut kick here. You see this a lot in sport Taekwondo with this front leg side kick. And what you can do is to thwart that is to essentially just be on top of it. Our next principle is the conservation principle. Now there's two types of conservation that I like to describe, and that's the conservation of motion and conservation of energy. These are critical. So conservation of motion I want to talk about first, because historically martial arts does not reward people who extend themselves. There are a lot of consequences. An extended limb is a broken limb. You hear that said in things like jiu-jitsu. But it's more than that. If I'm blocking and defending, one of the reasons that the old traditional style blocking with this kind of stuff in traditional Taekwondo, the reason this doesn't work is it breaks the law of conservation of motion. And what happens here is that by overextending this big motion, I have to cover this much more ground to block the next incoming attack. The more that I extend, the more I overextend. The more I overextend, the more I leave myself susceptible to incoming attacks. Instead, it's much better to keep my motion small and achieve the same result. Conservation of energy works on the same principle. It's limiting the way that I have to move in small gestures or no gestures as much as possible. So, for example, one of the reasons the Philly shell is so effective is because it follows the rule of conservation of motion and energy. I can block with just my shoulder. That's a very limited motion. If my head's down, all I have to do is this. This means I don't have to expend as much energy. I can stay relaxed. I can avoid fatigue. And I don't leave myself extended so that the next incoming attack I leave myself open to. Principle number 7 is the patterns principle. It is essentially understanding the idea that a lot of deception in martial arts comes through the idea of setting and breaking patterns. The level change roundhouse kick from an open stance is an excellent example of this, where I set a pattern by kicking to the midsection. I'm striking, I set a pattern, kicking to the midsection, and then I come out, pop, and I go high section. I'm setting the pattern, setting them the idea of defending a thing, and when they become accustomed to it, now I break that. Now, when I break the pattern, I'm going to use a change in elevation, timing, direction, and angle, stuff like that. And when I do this, that setting and the breaking of pattern is going to allow me to deceive my opponent. Same thing occurs in reverse. I need to be aware of patterns for my ability to read my opponent. This is going to allow me to not only learn to identify weaknesses in my opponent, but also to avoid the traps that are going to set for me. There's that idea that if you do something twice, expect to change up on the third one. So if my opponent, feints a couple times, expect on the third one something different's going to happen. But the patterns principle, because of that, is an important principle of awareness in your fighting. Our 8th principle today is the Prequels Principle. And this means that actions lead to results. In other words, when I watch a fight sequence and I watch somebody land a successful combination, that shot that they land is the result. The prequels is what goes into that, and that's what you need to pay attention to. What feinting, what setups, what angle changes, the things that set up and the work that goes into it is what yields results. People are often focused on the end result of landing a punch, and they don't pay enough attention to the prequels and the things that go on before that. That's the stuff that matters. And that's the stuff that we need to pay attention to with the Prequels Principle. Our 9th principle is the luring principle, which is essentially drawing them into traps. This is something that I'm a big fan of. It's part of the reason that I like to do a lot of retreating in my fighting. It doesn't necessarily have to be a retreating motion, but it's essentially drawing them into your traps. One of the ways I might do that is stepping in and drawing back. Or I might use what's called the 1st and 3rd principle, where I come in, I'm first, and then I draw back to draw out a response, and then I throw my counter. I'm luring him into my trap. All right, our 10th principle, and the last one on this video, is going to be the Psyops Principle. It's the psychological warfare that takes place. There are a ton of different examples of this. I have 5 examples here that I actually wrote down so I don't forget them, because I wanted to kind of touch on some of the key points. The first one is going to be projected intention. What that means is that when I'm sparring, a lot of times when I'm going to attack high, I might look low and then do this, right? This is the principle of projected intention. It's not just where you look, it's also projecting my body energy. I project myself upward, 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 and then I kick low. That's projected intention. It's a sub-principle. The second one is the distortion principle, where I'll give you a good example of this. Holly Holm is really good at this. So I give them some sort of distorted response that is used to deceive them. A good example, I mentioned Holly Holm, is she does key-ups. She's known for going when she strikes, right? I can change that to mess with their head. I can throw it and I key up when I'm not attacking. Or I can not key up when I go to attack. So I go that audio cue, it throws people off. Okay, so that's another example. In addition to projected intention and distorted triggers, we also have false fatigue and false injury. This is when somebody catches you, oh, pa! You trick them, okay? This is really what Psyops is all about, is being tricky. Distractions, I swear to God I've actually used this in my roles of jiu-jitsu. I go, whoa, what's that? And then I pass a guard. I'll also do stuff is lie to your opponent. Look, here's the thing. When I'm teaching, I don't do this to my students, but if I'm at jiu-jitsu roll with a buddy, if I get some white belt maybe who's new, I might be in the middle of a roll and be like, whoa, 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 you don't want to do that. And then they stop and go, oh, and then I'll do whatever I want to do. I'll sweep them or something like that, and then I'll tell them afterwards, like, no, you really should have done that. Don't listen to me. I'm not on your side of this. I will show them outside of the roll what the correct thing to do is, but during that roll, you and I are not on the same side, so I'm going to use trickery. And I've done all sorts of crazy stuff. Last night, I was in the middle of passing a guard, and I asked the guy, I said, hey, why'd the chicken cross the road? And he goes, huh? And I go, because! And I passed his guard. And he was like, what? He was so busy thinking about this stupid joke that I distracted him. The last one for Psyops is something that you don't do with a buddy. That's the Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Conor McGregor situation, right? You can go too far with this one, but there is something to be said when it comes to self-defense of psyching your opponent out. You know, if I tell a guy who's getting ready to get in a fight with me that I'm going to knock you down and scrape my car keys across your eye when I'm done, they're going to have a moment of pause and be like, there's something not right. Same thing like if I go, hey, I have AIDS, they'd be like, whoa, I don't know if I want to fight this guy. Or, you know, some crazy stuff like that. It's something to give guys a moment of pause in a self-defense situation. Sometimes that moment of pause might immediately stop it, or sometimes it might have an indirect effect where they go to get into an altercation, and there's just going to be something in their head that's going to be like, I don't know if I want to pull the trigger. This is what Conor McGregor did to Jose Aldo in a lot of ways, is when he fought Jose Aldo, he was just in his head before the fight, talking about, I'm the greatest and you're nothing. That kind of stuff is also really effective. So psychological warfare is a big part of fighting. And like I said, on the mats, I like to have a lot of fun with it. You know, I go, right? The look back is a good example. Sean O'Malley does this, right? He goes here, looks back, and he does that kind of thing. People are distracted by something that's outside the corner of their frame and stuff like that. So I love all this stuff. If you have examples, I'd love to see what you have as well. But this is 1 to 10 for our principles of striking. Remember, go to my website, Devil Dog Martial Arts, for the full list. And then I'm going to keep doing videos on these. So I hope you like it, and thanks for watching.